the garden that bloomed by starlight. Elorin carried the teachings of the silver-pawed visitor like a soft light inside his chest, a brightness that did not ask to be shown but quietly warmed every place his attention touched. And in the days after the cat began to appear and vanish with the serene confidence of a star crossing a clear night, he found himself drawn to a small neglected patch of earth at the northern base of Wistmere Tower, a corner where thistle and dry grass had collected, and where the soil had settled into a crust that looked stubborn only until one noticed the fine cracks that spoke of thirst and possibility, and he thought of the river's drifting lights and of how memory can heal what was ignored, and he decided that this ground deserved the same listening he had offered the water. He fetched a spade and a shallow basket and a wooden rake left by some earlier caretaker whose careful notches still marked the handle, and he knelt and pressed his palm to the soil and waited until the tower's hum answered within his bones. Then he began to loosen the surface, not tearing but lifting, coaxing clods into crumble, and each turn released a scent of mineral and leaf that reminded him of rain that had considered falling and decided to wait for evening. A few earthworms waved with slow grace, and Elorin moved them gently to a shaded dish while he cleared stones not much larger than plums, and he washed those stones in the basin to free their colors, then set them in a quiet ring at the edge of the bed so that they could become a kind border, and he hummed a tune without words that matched the rhythm of the rake's teeth drawing lines that pleased the eye. He collected fallen leaves from the orchard and spread them with his fingers as if tucking a child to sleep, and the leaf blanket whispered as it settled, a sound like pages turned by a considerate wind, and he carried a bucket from the river, walking with the soft wrist that the cat had taught him, so the water did not slosh in complaint but lay quiet as a mirror, and when he poured, the bed darkened to a welcoming brown and drank with evident relief. Master Aldrin passed once with an armful of split wood and paused to watch, saying little, though his eyes shone with the kind approval that gives strength to quiet work, and he set a small sack of crushed eggshells on the threshold without announcement so that when Elorin returned he found the gift waiting like a kind thought. Every morning and evening he resolved to do nothing other than keep the bed company, to rake and water and tidy, to tell its stories chosen for steadiness, stories of the backward feather and the river lights and of the cat who could walk upon the air, and he noticed that in the company of such tales the soil took on a calm fragrance like sun-warmed straw, and that his own breathing began to copy the patient pace of the earth itself. Sometimes he felt the brush of fur against his ankle and looked up to find the cat circling the bed with steps that left faint silver ovals upon the turned earth, as though the ground were the surface of a night lake and the paws could write upon it without bruising anything beneath. And when the prints faded he kept their path in mind as a boundary he would not cross, a ring of permission. By daylight nothing startling occurred. A few tiny shoots lifted and reconsidered, perhaps tasting the air and choosing to wait. Bees passed on their errands to the clover farther down and returned carrying the perfume of the fields, and the river made a melodious folding sound against its pebbles that drifted across the yard like a lullaby for anyone who might be tempted to rest. But Elorin sensed another kind of time leaning across the garden, a time that belonged to the stars. He had seen how the river stored voices and how the tower stored footsteps, and he wondered whether the sky might store seeds, and the thought made him smile at his own fancy while also filling him with a practical wish to see what night might teach. On the fifth evening he carried no lamp because the moon hung over the orchards and the tower roof held a narrow silvering like frost, and he sat on a flat stone at the edge of the bed and folded his hands and let the day's busyness settle until his thoughts felt arranged like smooth pebbles in a clear jar. He greeted the first star he saw as one greets an old tutor whose kindness is remembered, and then a second, and as their light drew fine lines across the air he felt the bed itself draw a breath. It was not a sudden thing. The soil seemed to relax the way a hand opens after it has carried a bucket a long way. Thin stems lifted from below, each with the cautious dignity of someone entering a quiet room, and the stems uncurled leaves so tender they made him think of folded notes that loved to be read slowly. Bud tips swelled like rain beads, and then in the hush the first petals opened, revealing a blue that resembled the inside of twilight, and beside it a violet with a faint inner glow, and beside that a small cup of pale gold that seemed to hold within it a patient flame. The starlight did not strike these flowers as sunlight does. It seemed to enter them like water entering soft moss, saturating without a splash, and the blooms answered by breathing fragrance so light that it had to be discovered by a listener rather than found by a searcher. He lowered his face until the cool whisper of the night touched his cheeks and the perfume of the garden arrived like music under music, a mixture of clean rain memory and crushed clover and something honeyed that existed nowhere except here. The tower walls warmed behind him as if leaning closer to see, and in a high window a small circle of glass caught starlight and sent it downward in a slender path that rested across the bed as if blessing it. The cat appeared soundlessly upon that path, first as two floating ovals of glow, then as a sleek silhouette whose tail drew a curve as even as a river bend, and it stepped among the flowers without bending them, the silver of its paws brightening each blossom it touched. Elorin whispered that he was grateful and that he would take care, and the cat sat and listened with him, and for a long while nothing else happened because nothing else was needed. The flowers went on opening. White bell shapes with insides tinted faint pink like morning milk. Spiraled stars that opened petal by petal as if following a slow song. Flat round discs that took the starlight and reflected it like small moons set in soil. A breeze reached them from the river and passed over the garden as gently as a hand lowering a blanket upon a sleeping child, and the tallest stems inclined and returned, and in their movement was a rhythm Elorin felt in his chest, soft and repeating, steadying his thoughts into long, even lines. He cupped water from a bowl he had set nearby and poured a little around the base of each plant, and the water made a silky sound when it met the root space, as if the earth was saying yes in a vocabulary older than speech. From a nearby hedge drifted the quiet wing strokes of a moth pale as parchment, and it visited each bloom in a patient circle, drawing sweetness and leaving behind perhaps a wish. Elorin had brought a notebook because habit is a friend, yet the page remained blank, for some nights are meant to be held only by breath and memory. From that night the bed learned a new rhythm. By day the flowers rested with their faces folded, green leaves keeping the soil company and giving shade to small beetles that did important work no one saw. By evening the blooms rose when the first star appeared, and if clouds covered the sky they opened a little, but when the heavens were clear they opened wide and invited fragrance to travel, and the yard became a mild country of perfume and quiet color. Elorin tended with greater devotion, not out of urgency but out of love for these slow conversations. He sifted a little sand into the soil where water pooled, and he tucked moss around a root that had risen, and he placed a ring of smooth stones to guard a particularly delicate blue star, and he sang to the bed in a small voice that stayed inside the teeth so as not to intrude, and he found that when he spoke kindly to the watering can it poured in an even ribbon, as if pleased to be included. Sometimes Master Aldrin joined him, carrying 2 cups of thyme tea that released an herb bright steam into the night, and they sipped with the care such fragrance deserves, and Aldrin would remark that some gardens wake when others sleep, and that midnight is a kind of morning for certain seeds. Elorin heard truth in that and stored it beside the other lessons the tower had given him. The cat became the garden's familiar guardian. It prowled along invisible rails just above the bed and drew silver paths that the flowers seemed to follow when turning, and sometimes it placed a paw above a spot where nothing grew, holding it there until Elorin brought a little compost or loosened the crust with a patient touch, and soon a tender green would push up as if answering a whisper. One night the cat pressed both front paws to the air and then placed them upon Elorin's palms, and he felt a cool brightness flow into his skin, not a shock but a slow fill, and his hands became aware of 3 kinds of soil within the bed, one that preferred shallow thirst, one that liked to drink deeply, one that loved a mist. With this new listening he adjusted his care and the plants rewarded him with steady color. Another night a soft bell of wind passed over the orchard and the petals moved together as if they shared a single breath, and in that movement Elorin realized that the garden was not a collection of individuals, but a quiet choir whose members trusted each other to hold the notes when needed. To honor that revelation he placed shallow bowls of water at the corners of the bed to reflect the sky into the leaves. He crafted the bowls from old clay he found in the cellar and glazed them with a thin wash of honey and ash, and when he set them out the stars took their time settling into the water, and the reflections shook only when a moth drank and the ripples carried small galaxies closer to the roots. On a clear evening when frost lingered in the lower meadow yet spared the yard, the garden made a low sound that was not touchable by ear so much as by skin, a gentle vibration that seemed to say we are well, and Elorin felt tears slip from the corners of his eyes because the message had no demand and no fear, only belonging. He wiped the tears with the back of his hand and let a few fall upon the soil, and the cat touched that place with a paw, and the spot shone a little longer than the others, then faded, as all real things do, into the next moment. The river remembered them during these nights. Sometimes a drifting light rose from the bends and skimmed the garden wall, pausing over a cluster of violet cups before continuing downstream. When Elorin lifted a hand toward such a visitor, he did not ask for a story, he simply offered his breath as a place to rest, and the orb rested and then went on, leaving a scent like rain on stone. At times he thought he heard those who had tended the yard before him, the hush of a woman smoothing soil with her palm, the pleased murmur of a child counting buds, the sound of a broom being set with its bristles lifted so they would keep their rounded smile, and the past did not feel far away or heavy, only companionable. On the seventh night he rose when the stars were at their calmest, that hour when even the owls have finished their rounds, and stand thinking on the highest branches. He carried a bowl polished to clarity and placed it in the center of the bed. The cat came at once and sat with its paws on the rim so that 4 small circles of silver crowned the glass. Elorin spoke a quiet invitation to the sky, not asking for a spectacle, only for enough light to teach him patience, and the stars answered by thickening their glow until a slender thread of radiance pooled in the bowl like milk. He dipped 2 fingers and touched the top of each bud that it had not yet dared to open, and his fingers left a chill that was not cold and a warmth that was not heat, and each bud made a soft sound like a breath caught and released, and by the time he finished the first ones, had begun to flower. He sat back and watched and felt time unhook itself from minutes and climb into a wider shape where arrival mattered more than measure. In that shape he remembered how Aldrin once said that a house is only a house until someone listens to it, and then it becomes a companion, and he understood that the same was true of the ground, that soil is only soil until someone keeps it company through dark hours, and then it becomes a confidant. The moon set slow pink along the edge of the hills, and the first thin light of morning arrived like warm breath upon glass, and the blooms closed one by one, satisfied. He covered the bed with a veil of net to protect the leaves from the early sun, and went inside to rest his eyes, and as he climbed the stair he looked back and saw the cat curled in the bowl like a coiled star, guarding the last silver thread as it faded. When he woke later, the tower was full of the pleasant tasks of day. He mended a binding with glue that smelled faintly of wine. He polished the bell by the door without striking it. He wrote a few lines in his notebook that tried to name the exact shade of the blue that only opens under starlight, and decided that names were not needed for joys that already know themselves. In the afternoon he gathered compost of leaf and onion peel and a spoon of ash and folded it into the soil with fingers that were learning to be as respectful as words, and the cat watched from atop a post, tail curled, paws bright as drops of quicksilver. Evening brought a thin band of clouds and a wind from the sea that carried salt and distance, yet the garden woke again, undeterred. The flowers opened partway and then farther when the clouds thinned, and Elorin realized that faith was among their skills, that they trusted light to return as it always does, and that trust was as nourishing as water. Aldrin arrived with a small wooden box and opened it to reveal seeds shaped like commas and teardrops and curls of paper. He said that some travelers had sent them as thanks for a night of shelter. They were rare and preferred to wake beneath stars. Elorin planted them in tiny pockets where the cat's paws pressed warmer, and he brushed soil across the pockets as gently as he had once smoothed wrinkles from his blanket as a child. On a night when no moon rose, the stars grew more insistent and the garden responded with its fullest bloom. Elorin stood at the center of his humble plot and turned slowly, letting the cool leaves brush his trousers and the edges of his hands. He felt the tower behind him like a large friend who never tires, and the river before him like a faithful letter written again and again by water. He felt the cat at his left, the tap of one paw against his ankle telling him without words that stillness is a kind of dance. He heard the moth and the hedgehog and the distant shepherd closing a gate with the smallest clap of wood, and he thought the world might be as complete as a held breath. When at last he lay down between the bed and the low wall, he did not sleep at once, for he wished to honor the long patience that had led to this hour. He counted scents instead of numbers. Damp leaf, mint, star-warmed stone, a memory of bread, beeswax from the clay cup he had used to catch the first silver thread. His body grew heavy in the best way. The cat settled upon his chest, paws tucked, weight a reassurance. The flowers breathed the last deep breath of their night. The stars held their places with the modesty of good tutors who know when to let students speak. He slept and dreamed of a river made of seed, and of towers that grow from listening, and of cats whose paws write light upon the air so that children can learn to walk wherever kindness needs them. When morning came, he woke with the scent of dew on his skin and the sense that he had been watered with the garden, and he rose and folded the net, thanked the bowls, stroked the leaves with 2 fingers, and carried the new seeds to the step where the sun now warmed the stone. He found Master Aldrin there polishing a brass clasp, and the mentor looked up and smiled in the way that makes a day begin kindly. They shared bread and tea and did not speak much, for the best part of the lesson had already arrived, and after the cups were rinsed and set upside down to dry, Elorin returned to the garden and the cat followed. And the cat walked the air above the bed and drew another invisible circle with its silver paws, and within that circle the soil felt ready for whatever night would bring next, and he felt ready too, which is a very simple joy and a very great one.